Don't stop.
Zarah woke to unfamiliar weight on her finger. The ring was platinum. Heavy. Expensive. Korean. Beside her, Kang Seok-jin was still asleep, silver at his temples, scars on his knuckles, one arm thrown across her waist like he owned her. Maybe he did. The contract she'd signed 3 weeks ago suggested as much. She should have felt trapped, caged, should have been plotting escape back to Lagos. Instead, she felt something worse. Safe. His hand twitched in sleep, pulling her closer. Her body responded before her mind could stop it, leaning back, settling in, letting him hold her. She'd spent 23 years learning to survive. Last night, she'd let herself soft, mistake. The sun rose over Seoul's skyline, washing the room in gold. Everything here was gold. The fixtures, the view, the lies they'd told at the courthouse. She came willingly, he'd said in front of the officiant. She'd signed the papers without correcting him, willingly. Zarah stared at her own hand, dark fingers against white sheets, platinum band catching light. 3 weeks ago, she'd watched him kill a man at Incheonport. 2 weeks ago, he'd bought her freedom with a marriage contract. Yesterday, he'd touched her for the first time, and she'd let him. Today, she had to decide if she regretted it. 3 weeks earlier, the cargo container had smelled like rust and seawater. Zarah had been at Incheonport tracking a shipment for her brother Chitty's logistics company. The company that was supposed to save their family. The company that had instead buried them in debt to people who didn't forgive and didn't forget. She'd heard voices. Korean, rapid and angry. Then a sound she'd recognize anywhere. A silenced gunshot, muffled but unmistakable. She should have run. Should have turned around and pretended she'd seen nothing. Instead, she'd looked. The man crumpled to the ground, a hole in his forehead, blood pooling beneath him in the sodium light. 3 men stood over the body. One of them turned, and security lights caught her face. She ran, behind her, shouts in Korean, footsteps pounding. She ducked between containers, her heart hammering, her breath coming in gasps. The port stretched endlessly, a maze of steel and shadow. She made it to the access road. Found a taxi. Gave the driver her hotel address in broken Korean, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold one notes. In her hotel room, she'd locked every lock, pushed furniture against the door, and called Chitty. No answer. She'd tried again, and again. On the 4th attempt, a voice answered. Not her brother. A stranger speaking Igbo with a Lagos accent. Your brother's been arrested, the voice said. Charges related to money laundering through Korean ports. The people he owes are very interested in speaking with his family. The line went dead. Zarah had sat on the hotel bed, staring at her phone, understanding with perfect clarity that she was alone in a foreign country, marked by people who killed without hesitation, and her brother was as good as dead. The knock on her door 2 hours later was polite, almost apologetic. She'd opened it to find 2 men in expensive suits and a 3rd man behind them. Older, maybe early 50s, with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes that measured her like she was a problem to be solved. Kang Seok-jin, he'd said in perfect English. We need to talk about your brother. She'd let them in because what choice did she have? He'd sat in her hotel chair like he owned it, like he owned the whole building, maybe the whole city. His men had stood by the door, silent and watchful. Your brother made poor choices, Seok-jin had said. He borrowed money from my competitors to finance shipping routes he couldn't afford. When the routes failed, he tried to cover his losses by moving their product through my ports without permission. That's not possible, Zarah had said. Chitty wouldn't do that. The evidence suggests otherwise. Seok-jin had pulled out a tablet, shown her shipping manifests, transaction records, surveillance footage of her brother meeting with men whose faces she didn't recognize. He owes $300,000. His creditors have set an execution date. 14 days, Zarah's mouth had gone dry. What do you want to make you an offer? He'd explained it simply. Marriage. 2 years. In exchange, her brother's debt would be cleared, the charges dropped, his life spared. She would come to Seoul, live as Seok-jin's wife, and ask no questions about his business. That's insane, she'd said. That's the offer. Why me? Why not just let him die? Seok-jin had studied her for a long moment. 3 months ago, you were at a hotel in Seoul. Gangnam district. Men came for you in the hallway. Her blood had frozen. She remembered. She'd been visiting Chitty, trying to understand his business problems. 3 men had grabbed her near the elevators, dragged her into a service corridor, pressed a knife to her throat. They wanted her to beg, to cry, to call Chitty and tell him to pay what he owed. She'd spit in their faces and cursed them in 3 languages instead. They'd knocked her unconscious. She'd woken in a hospital with Chitty weeping at her bedside. You were there, she'd whispered. I was there. Seok-jin's expression had been unreadable. I watched you fight 3 armed men with nothing but rage and a vocabulary that would make sailors blush. You didn't beg. You didn't break. That interested me. So you want to buy me because I'm stubborn? I want to marry you because you're strong. There's a difference, she'd laughed. It had sounded hysterical even to her own ears. And if I refuse, then your brother dies. His wife dies, their infant daughter dies. My competitors are thorough. Zarah had closed her eyes. Chitty had a daughter, 3 months old. She'd only seen pictures. Sweet round face, her father's eyes. You're a monster, she'd said, yes. But I'm offering you a choice. That's more than most get. She'd signed the papers that night. Seok-jin had produced a contract, already prepared, already notarized. 2 years, specific terms. She would live with him, appear publicly as his wife. Learn Korean. Learn to navigate his world. In exchange, her brother lived. There had been one clause that had made her pause. Physical intimacy is not required but may be negotiated, it read. She'd looked up at him. What does that mean? It means I won't force you, he'd said quietly. If and when anything happens between us, it will be your choice. Why? Because I want you willing. I can wait for 2 years, we'll see. The wedding had been 3 days later. Private ceremony in a courthouse, no guests, no flowers, no joy, just paperwork and lies. She'd worn a simple white dress that one of his people had purchased. He'd worn a black suit. The officiant had smiled and offered congratulations in Korean. Seok-jin had translated. She says we make ye a beautiful couple. Zarah had said nothing. When the officiant had asked if she came willingly, Seok-jin had answered for her. Yes, she came willingly. She'd signed her name. Zarah Okafor. Then he'd signed. Kang Seok-jin. And just like that, she'd become his wife. The apartment he'd taken her to was in Gangnam, all glass and steel and money. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Seoul's glittering skyline. Everything was modern, cold, beautiful in a way that made her homesick for Lagos's chaos. This is your home now, he'd said. This is a cage, she'd corrected. He'd handed her a phone. New number. Monitored. You can call your family once per week. Supervised, my passport, in my safe. You'll get it back when the contract ends. She'd wanted to scream, to throw something, to run. Instead, she'd asked, where do I sleep? He'd shown her to the master bedroom. Large bed, expensive sheets, view of the city. And where do you sleep? She'd asked. Here her stomach had dropped, but tonight I'll take the couch. He'd grabbed a blanket from the closet. You're exhausted. You're terrified. I'm not interested in forcing myself on a terrified woman. Sleep. Tomorrow, your real education begins. He'd left her standing there, alone in a stranger's bedroom in a foreign country, wearing a wedding ring that felt like a shackle. She'd cried that night. Quietly so he wouldn't hear. But he must have, because in the morning she'd found a plate of food outside the bedroom door. Nigerian food. Jollof rice and plantains and something that approximated egusi soup. A note beside it. I asked my chef to try. It's probably terrible. Eat anyway. It had been terrible. She'd eaten every bite. The training had started immediately. A woman named Minyu appeared the next morning. Late 30s, compact and lethal looking, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. I'm here to make sure you don't die, Minyu had said in accented English. Your husband has enemies. You're at Argot now. We have 3 months before your first public appearance. Learn fast, Zarah had learned. Self-defense, weapons handling, situational awareness. Korean language lessons twice a day. Cultural training, how to bow, when to speak. How to navigate Seoul's social hierarchies. It had been brutal. Her body had ached constantly. Her brain had felt like mush. But she'd pushed through because what choice did she have? Seok-jin had watched sometimes. Never commenting, just observing her with those calculating eyes. One afternoon, 3 weeks into her training, Minyu had shown her how to disarm someone with a knife. Again, Minyu had barked. Faster. Your attacker won't wait for you to remember the steps. Zarah had tried again. Failed again. Seok-jin had stepped into the training room. Minho had stepped back. He'd positioned himself behind Zarah, his body against her back, his hands covering hers on the practice knife. Feet wider, he'd murmured in Korean. She'd understood. Her language lessons were working. He'd adjusted her stance, his touch impersonal but firm. Feel the weight. Don't fight it. Redirect it. His breath had been warm on her neck. She'd frozen, hyper-aware of every point of contact. This was the closest they'd been since the wedding, now, he'd said. Move. She'd executed the disarm perfectly. Good. He'd stepped back. Again, she'd practiced for another hour. He'd watched the entire time. When Minyu finally called a break, Zarah had found him still there, You're learning quickly, he'd said. I'm motivated by fear, by survival. Something had shifted in his expression. Good, fear makes you sloppy. Survival makes you sharp. Why do you care? She'd asked. If I'm just a contract wife, why invest all this time and money in training me? He'd moved closer. Because you're mine now. I protect what's mine. I'm not a possession, no. You're my wife. That's more important. The distinction had felt meaningless. But the intensity in his eyes had made her pulse jump. If you enjoyed the tension building in Zarah's story, hit that subscribe button. This journey gets darker before it gets better, and you won't want to miss what happens next. The call with Chitty had come in week 4. Seok-jin had kept his promise. Once per week, supervised, her brother's voice had been thin and strained. Zarah, thank God. Are you okay? I'm alive, she'd said carefully, aware of Seok-jin sitting across from her. Are you? Yeah, I'm okay. They dropped the charges. I don't understand it. The evidence just disappeared. That's good, she'd managed. Where are you? Can I come see you? In Seoul. I'm staying here for a while. Silence. Then, with him, yes. Zarah, what did you do? What I had to. She'd heard him crying. Her strong older brother, who'd raised her after their father died, who'd tried so hard, tobbled something for their family. Crying because he understood what she'd sacrificed. I'm sorry, he'd whispered in Igbo. I'm so sorry. Don't be. Just take care of your daughter. I'll be fine. She'd hung up before he could hear her voice break. Seok-jin had watched her cry. After a moment, he'd pushed a box of tissues across the table. You can hate me, he'd said quietly. Most people do, but know this. Your brother is alive because of you. His daughter will grow up with a father because of you. That matters, does it? She'd asked bitterly. Yes, the first public appearance had been announced in week 8. A charity gala. High-profile business elite from across Asia. She would be introduced as Seok-jin's new wife. They'll stare, Minyu had warned during preparation. They'll whisper about your skin, your age, your background. Let them. You're there to show strength, not to make friends. Zarah had worn emerald silk that night. His choice. It had hugged every curve, made her dark skin glow against the fabric. Diamond earrings that cost more than her family's house in Lagos. She'd stared at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. Seok-jin had appeared in a tailored black suit. He'd stopped when he'd seen her. Just stopped and stared. Beautiful, he'd said softly. It's just a dress, no. It's you. The car ride to the gala had been tense. She'd felt his eyes on her the entire time. Are you nervous? He'd asked, terrified. Good. He'd taken her hand. Fear keeps you alert. Just stay close to me. If anything happens, Minyu will get yaoed. What could happen? He hadn't answered. The gala had been overwhelming. Hundreds of people in evening wear, speaking Korean and Japanese and Mandarin. Crystal chandeliers and chamber music and wealth so casual it was obscene. The whispers had started immediately. Zarah had caught fragments in Korean. Too young, African, scandal, gold digger. She'd lifted her chin and smiled. Seok-jin had kept her close, his hand on her lower back. Possessive, protective. She'd hated how safe Thaddeus had made her feel. They'd been making rounds, greeting business associates when Seok-jin's phone had buzzed. He'd checked it, and his entire body had gone rigid. Minyu, he'd said sharply in Korean. Stay with her. Minyu had materialized at Zarah's side. What's wrong? Before Seok-jin could answer, the lights had gone out, screaming. Gunshots. Chaos in the darkness. Zarah's training had kicked in. She dropped low, felt Minyu grab her arm. Then she'd heard it. The distinctive sound of a blade being drawn nearby. She'd turned. Seen the knife. Seen the man lunging toward where Seok-jin had been standing. She'd moved without thinking. Grabbed the attacker's wrist, twisted hard the way Minyu had taught her. The knife had clattered away, but the man had been stronger. He'd shoved her and she'd felt the blade of a second knife bite into her forearm as she'd fallen. Pain had exploded up her arm. Hot. Immediate, then Seok-jin had been there. She'd heard the wet crunch of bone breaking, the attacker's scream. More sounds she couldn't identify in the darkness. The lights had come back on. 3 men lay unconscious or dead around them. Seok-jin had been standing over them, blood on his knuckles, something feral in his eyes. Then he'd seen her bleeding arm and his expression had changed completely. Get a car, he'd barked at Minyu in Korean. Now, he'd carried her out himself. Right through the crowd of shocked onlookers, her blood staining his suit jacket, his face carved from ice. In the car, he'd pressed cloth to her wound with shaking hands. You're an idiot, he'd said. Voice rough. You're welcome, you could have died. So could you. His eyes had met hers. That's different. Why? Because you're important and I'm just a contract wife. Because I can't lose you. The words had hung between them. Raw, unplanned, the hospital had been a private wing, armed guards, no questions asked. They'd stitched her up while Seok-jin had paced outside like a caged animal. When they'd finally released her, he'd driven her home himself. No driver, no guards, just him and her in the Seoul night. Back at the apartment, he'd helped her to the couch, brought her water, pain medication. Hovered. I'm fine, she'd said. You're not fine. You took a knife for me. You would have done the same. That's my job. Maybe it's mine too now. He'd knelt in front of her, taking her uninjured hand. You shouldn't have done that, but I did. Why? She'd searched his face, seen the fear beneath the anger, the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide. I don't know, she'd whispered. I just reacted. You could have died, he'd repeated. Do you understand that? You could have died and I would have buried every person in that building. I would have burned Seoul to the ground. The intensity in his voice had stolen her breath. My wife, he'd said quietly, died 20 years ago. Cancer. She begged me to save her. Threw money at doctors, promises, bribes. I couldn't. She died hatting me for failing her. Zarah had gone still. When those men held a knife to your throat at that hotel 3 months ago, you fought. You cursed them in 3 languages. You didn't beg for your life. You took it back. He'd looked up at her. I watched you and thought, this woman doesn't break. I wanted that. I wanted someone who wouldn't beg me for the impossible, so you broke me yourself. No. His thumb had brushed over her knuckles. I gave you a chance to stay whole. She'd reached out with her good hand, cupped his face. This scarred, dangerous, complicated man who'd bought her like property but looked at her like she was precious. I don't understand you, she'd said. I don't understand myself around you. The kiss had been inevitable. Soft at first. Questioning, then desperate. He'd pulled back. We should stop. Why? Because you're injured. Because you're vulnerable. Because I want you willing, not grateful. What if I'm both, Zarah? She'd pulled him back to her. I'm done pretending this is just a contract. I'm done pretending I don't feel this, whatever this is. He'd kissed her again, deeper, hungrier. Then he'd scooped her up carefully, mindful of her arm, and carried her to the bedroom. This time they'd both slept in the bed. The next morning had brought complications, photos from the gala. Zarah covered in blood. Seok-jin carrying her out. Speculation in the media. Whispers in the organization. But there had been something else too. A leak. Someone had sold information about their marriage contract, the debt, the terms, Zarah's purchase price. The news had spread through Seoul's underworld like fire. Seok-jin had been cold with rage. Someone in my organization betrayed me. Do you know who? Not yet. But I will. The next weeks had been tense. Zarah had healed, returned to training. Started working at a medical clinic Seok-jin had set up in a safe house, treating people who couldn't go to hospitals. Injured operatives, abuse survivors, people who existed in the shadows. It had given her purpose beyond being his wife. But the betrayal had hung over them. Every public appearance had felt staged, forced. They'd had to project unity while privately knowing someone in Seok-jin's inner circle had sold them out. The fight had been inevitable. I'm not your puppet, she'd said one night after another carefully orchestrated public dinner. Then stop acting like a victim. You made me a victim and you're still breathing. You're welcome, she'd slapped him, he'd let her. Then he'd walked away. She'd found him hours later in his office, surrounded by papers and screens, hunting for the traitor. I'm sorry, she'd said from the doorway. Don't be. You're right. I did this to you. She'd crossed to him, stood behind his chair. Put her hands on his shoulders. I'm angry, she'd said quietly. At you, at this situation. At myself for not hatting it as much as I should. He'd tilted his head back to look at her. What do you want from me, Zarah? Honesty. He'd stood, turned to face her. I want you, not as a contract, not as an obligation. I want you to choose me, choose this. What if I already have? The kiss had been inevitable again. But this time it hadn't stopped at kissing. He'd lifted her onto his desk, scattering papers. His hands had found her thighs, pushing up her skirt. Her fingers had worked at his belt. Tell me to stop, he'd murmured against her mouth. Don't stop. They'd come together there on his desk, urgent and desperate. No gentleness, just need. Afterward, she'd sat there, dressed disheveled, breathing hard. He'd been on his knees in front of her, forehead pressed to her thigh. I didn't plan this, she'd said. I know. I don't regret it. Neither do I. They'd stayed like that for a long moment. Then he'd helped her dress, fixed her hair, kissed her once more. We'll find the traitor, he'd said. And then we'll figure out what we are. What are we? Mine. You're mine, not because of a contract, because I choose you too. The traitor had been found 2 days later. An accountant. 10 years of loyal service undone by greed and jealousy. Seok-jin had brought him to the apartment. Made Zarah watch. This man sold information about you, Seok-jin had said. Called you a bought whore and reports to my enemies. Do you want to be here for this? Yes. The accountant had begged, pleaded, made excuses. Zarah had stood silent, watching, learning exactly what kind of world she'd married into. Seok-jin had shot him cleanly. No torture, just efficiency. Take him away, he'd ordered his men in Korean. Compensate his family. They don't need to suffer for his stupidity. When they'd been alone, he'd turned to her. Are you okay? No, but I will be. He'd pulled her into his arms. This is who I am, I know. If you want to leave, I'm not leaving. The next surprise had come 2 weeks later. Seok-jin had woken her early, told her to pack a bag. Where are we going? Incheon Airport. Why? He'd smiled. You'll see. At the airport, she'd seen her mother and youngest sister in the arrivals area. She'd broken down crying right there, running to them, holding them, sobbing in Igbo. How? She'd asked Seok-jin later. You needed your family. So I brought them to you. Her mother had stayed for a week. Watched Zarah with worried eyes. Spoken little Korean but communicated everything through a translator Seok-jin had hired. One night her mother had pulled her aside. Are you happy here, Enani? Zarah had hesitated. I'm safe. That's not what I asked. I'm learning to be happy. Her mother had cupped her face. He's older than your father was, yes, but he looks at you like you are the son. Zarah had glanced at Seok-jin across the room, watching them with careful distance. I know, she'd whispered. When they'd said goodbye at the airport, her sister had hugged her tight. He loves you, she'd said. I can see it. Zarah had watched Seok-jin across the terminal, standing back to give her space with her family. I know, she'd said again. Back home, things had shifted. They'd stopped pretending, stopped performing. She'd moved her things in Tohai's bedroom. They'd shared meals, shared silence. Shared the careful building of something real. Then she'd missed her period. The test had been positive. She'd sat on the bathroom floor, staring at it, terror crashing through her. She was 23. He was 52. They lived in a world of blood and violence. And she was pregnant. When she'd told him, he'd gone very still. Then he'd knelt, pressed his forehead to her stomach. I'll protect you both, he'd said. I swear it. What if something happens to you? Then you'll be strong enough to survive without me. He'd looked up at her. What if I'm a terrible mother? You won't be. What if they come for the baby? Then I'll bury every threat before they're born. She'd believed him. The final threat had come when she was 4 months along. Not her brother this time, direct. A rival network had discovered the pregnancy. Seen it as an opportunity, they'd come for her at the clinic. Armed men. Professional, fast, mean you had fought, but they'd been outnumbered. Zarah could have hidden. Could have waited for Seok-jin. Instead, she'd fought. Used every technique she'd learned. Took down 2 attackers before reinforcements had arrived. When Seok-jin had burst through the door, he'd found her standing over bodies, blood on her hands, very pregnant and very lethal. He'd never looked more terrified or more proud. That night, he'd put divorce papers in front of her. You've proven you can survive this world, he'd said quietly. You don't need me anymore. The clinic is funded. Your brother's safety is guaranteed. You can take the baby and go. Be free. Zarah had stared at the papers. At this man who'd bought her freedom with a marriage contract and was offering her freedom from the marriage. I didn't survive this world, she'd said. I survived with you. There's a difference, Zarah. I'm not your captive anymore. I'm your partner. She'd pushed the papers back. I'm not leaving. I choose you. Iku's this. I choose us and the baby yours, not yours, not mine. Ours. He'd kissed her then, desperate and grateful and reverent. They'd rewritten the contract. No more guards inside the apartment. She'd kept her own passport. Her phone was hers, unmonitored. Partnership, not possession. They'd moved to a house on the coast between Seoul and Incheon. Fewer guards, more windows. Space for anniversary that blended Nigerian and Korean elements. Chitty had visited. Tense at first, guilt-ridden. I'm sorry, he'd said. You didn't sell me, Zarah had told him. Dad's choices aren't yours. Are you happy? She'd looked at Seok-jin across the room, one hand on her swollen belly. Yes. Finally, yes, labor had been brutal. 30 hours. Zarah had cursed in 3 languages. Seok-jin had held her hand through all of it, whispering in Korean and broken Igbo. When their son was born, healthy and perfect, Zarah had held him and cried. Mixed heritage. 2 cultures. 1 family. Seok-jin had touched the baby's tiny hand with wonder. What should we name him? Zarah had looked at this man who'd bought her freedom and given her so much more. Who'd turned a cage into a home. Who'd loved her until she'd learned to love him back. Hope, she'd said. His name is Hope. Now, weeks later, Zarah woke in their coastal home to morning light and her husband's arm around her waist. The platinum ring caught the sun. Heavy, expensive, chosen. She turned in his arms. He woke immediately, those gray eyes finding hers. Good morning, she said in Korean. Her accent was still thick, but he'd told her he loved it. Good morning, he said in Igbo. His pronunciation was terrible, but she loved it anyway. From the nursery, Hope began to cry. They both smiled. Your turn, Zarah said. Our turn, he corrected. They rose together. 2 people from different worlds who'd built a bridge out of impossible circumstances. Who'd turned a contract into a covenant. Who'd transformed survival into love. Zarah picked up her son, this perfect blend of Lagos and Seoul, and looked at Seok-jin. He was watching them both with an expression she'd learned to recognize. Devotion. Fierce and unwavering. "I don't regret it," she said quietly. "Any of it, neither do I," he kissed her forehead, "than their sons. Best contract I ever signed. Outside, the ocean stretched endlessly. Inside, their family breathed and lived and loved. She'd come to Korea in chains. She was leaving them as her own woman, not his possession, not his cage, his partner, his equal, his choice as he was hers." If Zarah and Seok-jin's journey moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Afro-Korean Stories TV. Drop a comment telling us what you felt during this story, and hit that like button if you believe love can bloom even in the darkest circumstances. More stories like this are coming, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep believing in unexpected love.